As always, such an honor to be with you today. And I bring, by way of opening words, this poem by Anne Sexton called Welcome Morning. There is joy in all, in the hair I brush each morning, in the cannon towel newly washed that I rub my body with each morning, in the chapel of eggs I cook each morning, in the outcry from the kettle that heats my coffee each morning, in the spoon and the chair that cry, "Hello there, Anne," each morning, in the godhead of the table that I set my silver plate cup upon each morning. All this is God right here in my pea green house each morning, and I mean, though often forget, to give thanks, to faint down by the kitchen table in a prayer of rejoicing, as the holy birds at the kitchen window peek into their marriage of seeds. So while I think of it, let me paint a thank you on my palm for this God, this laughter of the morning, lest it go unspoken. The joy that isn't shared, I've heard, dies young.
The chalice will now be lit in the sanctuary.
Our words from the Reverend Gretchen Haley. So let us breathe. Let's not go building new walls around our hearts. We have already enough that keeps us from each other, enough that keeps us from ourselves, and the knowing of all that we have done, all that has been done to us, for the losses we sustained, the love we avoided, the life we held too tight. For this hour we practice showing up with a willingness to see, to be seen, to remember ourselves whole and still becoming, to believe it is okay to not be okay, that we are loved even when we feel unlovable, that we belong even when the ground comes out from under us, to be for each other a surprising generosity, a sudden sweetness, a sign of hope, the start of a new day. Together we can be this brave. Come, let us worship together. We'll now hear a song that I was honored to be part of. You can't quite hear my voice because I am one of 17,572 singers. Eric Whitaker, composer and choral conductor, has been doing virtual choirs for years, and after the pandemic and our shutdown orders and our stay at home and our inability to sing together, he wrote this song and invited us to join. I'll put the lyrics in the chat, but I hope that you enjoy this brief time of quiet joy.
So
starting in 2016, I sang our hymns, one a day, all the hymns from both of our hymnals. My commitment to myself was to sing them in order, no matter what the occasion. That meant, of course, that all the songs were out of season. I was singing Christmas songs in the spring and Easter tunes in the summer, which added a bit of curiosity and occasionally delight to the process. This got harder in the days after the 2016 election when I was singing the cheerful morning songs. Morning is broken, bring, O morn, thy music, morning so fair to see. To say that these hymns did not match my mood is an understatement. There was a sense of dissonance, a jarring insult to the moment. I nearly gave up the practice at that point, but something in me said I still needed to at least make room for the possibility that healing and joy from singing would creep in, even if I wasn't ready to receive it at that moment. And I'm glad I did, because singing through that difficult season and through other losses and crises kept me grounded in one of the best parts of our being human, our propensity for joy. Now, I hear you saying, joy now? We're in the middle of a pandemic with no end in sight. And that's on top of all the other suffering and injustice that continues in our nation and our world. Suffering and injustice that doesn't care that there's a virus trying to kill us. Oh, and murder hornets and nunchuck-wielding bears that don't care either. All of these things, racism, homophobia, income inequality, misogyny, ableism, gun violence, none of it goes away because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And in fact, the pandemic seems to amplify many of those concerns. So how do we talk about joy? And yet here I am doing exactly that. Because if we deny joy until all the world is affirmed and fed and clothed and peaceful and free and liberated, we will spend generations in a dark and joyless world, and we may not survive. And that is sad, because joy is an upswelling of life. Joy is what makes life worthwhile. It also makes the hard work of justice worthwhile. And yes, joy works in concert with our righteous anger. In his book, Between Heaven and Mirth, Jesuit priest James Martin writes this: the anger that rises in you over an unjust situation may be a sign that God is moving you to address the injustice. But where is the joy then? It comes from an awareness that God is working through the compassion you feel. I remember reading something from Mother Teresa where she said, always approach the work with a smile. Even that hard, hard work of facing abject poverty. And what's surprising about the work is how much joy already exists out there. A number of years ago, 3 members of my home congregation in Saratoga Springs went to do some justice work in El Salvador. They were amazed at the joyful reaction of people in a desperately poor neighborhood. These people who danced and celebrated and shared their meager provisions and music and joie de vivre with these visitors from El Norte. We experience this surprising joyfulness in the art and music and culture of the oppressed. In our hymnals, we have a song that came from the American South, created by enslaved Africans. It is a solemn song. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. And each verse ends with glory, hallelujah, a cry of hope. You would think a people so horribly and appallingly oppressed would have had little to be hopeful about, yet it is hope and joy that comes from within that is the organic pulse of life. It is faith born in the midst of deep suffering that allowed enslaved Africans to hope for liberation and a vision of freedom. And it is joy that underlies liberation. Joy exists in the paintings and murals and graffiti of marginalized communities, in the spirituals of the 19th century, in the blues of the 20th century. Even today, as theologian James Cone remarks, joy and hope exist in the sermons, songs, and stories of the oppressed as they respond to the vision that stamps dignity upon their personhood. Dignity. To be joyful is to be dignified and to dignify our humanity. And what better way to support people in horrific situations, oppression, poverty, violence, than to treat everyone with dignity and celebrate their whole selves, not just the parts of themselves that are suffering. And the truth is, we are much more attracted to people who express joy rather than hide it behind the facade of gravitas. When we've been through a tough time, often we reach for something that brings us joy. A loved one, a pet, an upbeat song, a comedy movie. We need joy. And while we have flattened the curve here in New York State and are in phase 4 of reopening, it's not the same everywhere. And the infection and death rates continue to rise at an alarming rate. And we are still in a time of sustained violence and oppression and trauma for those around us. We need all the joy we can get. Dr. Kimberley Norris, an authority on confinement and reintegration at the University of Tasmania, says that we have moved from the first period of isolation, a time of panic buying and confusion and fear, to the second period, the honeymoon, where it felt novel and different as we learned new technology and enjoyed working in pajamas and binge-watched our favorite shows. But now we're in the very long third period, a time of loneliness, frustration, anxiety, despair, a time of hollow-eyed stares, odd fixations, and brooding resentment. According to studies of how long humans can survive in space, they find the moods drop about 2/3 of the way through a mission. And when there's unclarity about when a time of isolation will end, it is even harder. Because while there seem to be glimmers of hope, in our case, a flattening curve in our state, the uncertainty of how long this will actually last means that this third period could last a really long time. Our moods are suffering. Our souls are screaming for soul lifts. We're getting snippy and intolerant. We're looking into the future and wondering when and if we can celebrate birthdays and holidays and go on vacations and attend concerts and return to worship services and sing with one another. And those long looks at the calendar bring a sense of futility. We are in what is called liminal space, an in-between time. And we're not good in these kinds of spaces for very long. We need all the joy we can get. So where do we find it? Well, the truth is, just coming to church on a Sunday was an incredibly good way to bring joy into our lives. Maybe you remember what happened in the before times. As you pulled into that parking lot, you waved to those already there as you walked up the hill. You joyfully got out of your cars and into the building where you were greeted with smiles and handshakes and hugs. Someone remembered another's birthday and handed them a card. Someone else gave out small jars of sourdough starter that they promised to share. Kids ran around joyfully, laughing and playing and getting ready for their classes. 2 other people pulled out their phones finally to schedule a long overdue coffee date. Someone told a dad joke and was met with groans and giggles. Someone thanked another for the project they helped complete. A couple listened closely as someone shared hard news. More hugs, more handshakes, more smiles, more laughs, more conversation, until the signal that worship was about to begin, and you all then sat together, sang together, listened together, spent a radiant, joyful hour together. We don't have that weekly injection of physical being with others, that interactive joy. And we do our best online. Our Zoom calls and phone calls and drive-bys feed us, but most of our joy these days isn't a byproduct of being in community. We have to intentionally seek it out. And I encourage you to do so. There's a site called The Aesthetics of Joy that offers some fairly easy ideas you can try. They suggest you use the good dishes and other good items you were saving for special occasions. Make someone else laugh. I mean, this is a great time to share bad puns and funny videos. Throw a virtual party. It could be a dance party, a dinner party, a cocktail party, a watch party, game night, knitting circle, anything that is not just faces staring back at you. Wear something joyful. A friend does dress up Fridays with her family with various themes. This week it was polka dots. Sing and dance and engage in the arts. Perhaps you're finally watching shows you put off. Maybe they seem mindless, but the stories engage you. And perhaps you're discovering, as I have, how many stage plays and musicals there are online. Hamilton, of course, on Disney Plus, but so many being streamed from Broadway and the West End and beyond. We find them on YouTube, on PBS, other places. And almost every day there is a musician putting on virtual concerts for free. Breathe into the joy that is the creativity of performing arts. And don't forget creating yourself. You may not think of yourself as an artist, but any act of creativity sparks our spirits alive. As acting teacher Stella Adler writes, life crushes your soul, and art reminds you that you have one. Now here's the thing, right? You may not instantly feel joy or even recognize it as joy because we have been beaten down for so long. This pandemic has only amplified the sustained trauma many have been experiencing. It's okay. It's okay. Joy sneaks in anyway. In the last few weeks, I had some hard days dealing with the long third period of this pandemic. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was anxious at 6s and 7s. I was squirrely. I was unsettled. I finally started flipping through YouTube to see if anything caught my eye, which it did. I remembered that there is a British television show I like called Taskmaster. Now, if you're not familiar with Taskmaster, it is best described by The Guardian as a show where comedians are filmed playing stupid games, then gather on a stage to argue over the footage. It's ridiculous and silly, and it shouldn't work, and it is in its 10th season with no signs of stopping. So I put on an episode feeling still anxious and sad and not in the mood for anything really, but what the heck, English accents and no dramatic storyline seemed about as much as I could handle in that moment. And soon, while watching 5 comedians try to pop a bubble with their nose, I burst out laughing. And the guffaws kept coming too when the next task invited them to create the biggest splash they could. And then measure the circumference of a trailer with baked beans. I mean, it's ridiculous. Stupid tasks, hysterical banter. Result? I was utterly surprised by the joy I felt, and it was balm for my troubled soul. I heard the glorious sound of my soul waking up. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying we have to feel joyful all the time. Sadness, anger, fear, anxiety, all of these emotions are natural, even desirable responses to all that we are experiencing and witnessing. When we feel fully, we know we are emotionally alive. But joy should never be left out of that mix. I want to suggest two more things we can do to make conditions favorable for joy to surprise us. And the first is practice gratitude. In fact, let's practice gratitude right now. If you're in a room with someone else, turn to them and tell them something that you are grateful for. If you're alone, type it in the chat. Let's just take a moment to share a moment of gratitude. I, of course, am grateful to be with you all today. Reverend Josh, family, absolutely. Grateful for my husband and this community, friends and neighbors, the very green trees outside our windows. Grateful for a silver lining of the pandemic, quality time with my young adult children. Yes. Grateful for my husband who's been supporting me. Grateful for my daughter helping me get through the pandemic. And there are many more that will come in. Many about friends and family and our environment and the enjoyment of all that we hear, the art that we engage. Grateful for the people here in this community. And it feels pretty good, doesn't it? It feels good to share a moment of gratitude, something joyful. Yes. At the very least, you may have felt a small sense of relief. Well done. Now, practice that every day. Like all new skills, start small. Take one moment, like we just did. Then build it up. Maybe be grateful for something when you wake up, like I'm grateful I woke up. And when you go to bed, I'm grateful for clean sheets. Add a little gratitude to your meals. I'm grateful for this food and those who prepared it. And before you know it, you'll be practicing gratitude. And you'll find yourself being grateful for bigger things. I'm grateful for these virtual worship services. I'm grateful for our commitment to justice. I'm grateful for the helpers and the caregivers. And you know what happens when you're grateful for something? Bam! A little joy comes in. The second thing I'd like to encourage you to is a riff off of Gandhi. Be the joy you want to see in the world. This one's a bit tougher, especially right now when we're rarely amongst others. But it's all too easy in our coffee hours, small groups, phone and Zoom conversations in our families to talk about the fear and anxiety and frustration and anger. I mean, there's a reason for the cliche misery loves company. But if we remember that we are not our environment and that we have an effect on our environment, then we can hold on to those moments that bring joy in. It's just about making the conditions right to invite joyfulness. Not, I don't have a care in the world joyful, but honest, grateful glimmers of hope. Our souls saying, yes, we've been through it and we know there's a light at the end of the tunnel. That deep, rich joy. That is the joy our faith calls us to know that joy indeed cometh in the morning. It's so easy to sink into frustration and despair, and more so than ever, we must at least make the conditions right to invite joy in, because the alternative is unbearable. So, let joy propel us and buoy us in these uncertain and difficult days. Let there be joy.
Thank you.
Our closing words come from Molly Fumia. To be joyful in the universe is a brave and reckless act. The courage for joy springs not from the certainty of human experience, but the surprise, our astonishment at being loved, our bold willingness to love in return. These wonders promise the possibility of joyfulness, no matter how often and how harshly love seems to be lost. Therefore, despite the world's sorrows, give thanks for our loves, for our joys, and for the continued courage to be happily surprised. Go in peace, go in love, go in joy. And now I invite you to make a joyful noise in your homes as we join Kathy and Giselle with Turn the World Around, remembering that whether you are singing or clapping or making noise on an instrument or even making animal noises, it is all part of the great joy of this song and our lives.